this week we are finishing Matthew chapter 2. We've been going through the Gospels, sort of, through at least the early life, Jesus' birth basically is all we've really got through so far. And where we finished last week is that Jesus has been born, the wise men have come and worshipped him, and then they've gone back to Parthia, back to the east, and Herod has realized they've tricked them. And they're not going to come and tell him where this new king has been born, Herod, who's king in Judea. And so he sends people to go and basically kill all the babies under 2 years old in the town of Bethlehem. And God warns Joseph that that's what's going to happen. And so Joseph takes Mary and Jesus and they flee to Egypt. Yeah. And so he's in exile in Egypt now, Jesus. And then that's where we pick up this week. Yep.
After Herod had died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." So he got up and took the child and his mother and returned to the land of Israel.
All right. So this is where Matthew continues the story. So he says, after Herod died. So we're going to explore a little bit about what that actually means, because, well, okay. Herod was king in the area of Judea from about 37 BC until they believe he died around 4 BC. Though some people think it might have been up to 2 BC. And basically that's because when you're dealing with ancient calendars, things get really messy. And it depends on which lunar eclipse you count from, basically, to figure out when he dies. And most people believe it was around about 4 BC, but some people think it might have been closer to 2. Doesn't really matter. All it affects is, we know pretty much when Jesus began his ministry. It's around about 28 AD. We know that he was about 30 years old at the time. It doesn't say exactly, but it says around 30 years of age. He started his ministry. And so when he was born is thought to be somewhere between 6 and 2 BC. All it really affects is how old exactly he was at the time that he started his ministry. Now, we've already read that this Herod was pretty brutal and ruthless in his life, right? Kind of killed anybody who got in the way, anybody who was a threat to his throne. And we've just read about how he massacred all of these babies in Bethlehem because, to try to kill Jesus, because he was worried about Jesus taking his throne. Now, thankfully, Herod will not escape justice for the things that he did in eternity. But he didn't really escape this life without a little bit of justice either, because he apparently died a pretty ruthless and brutal death. There's a Jewish historian called Josephus who wrote about 100 years after this, and he says that basically God judged Herod for his sins in the way that he died. He wrote this: "For a fire glowed in him slowly, which did not so much appear to the touch outwardly as it augmented his pains inwardly." It wasn't so obvious from the outside, but inside he was in increasingly agonizing pain. "For it brought upon him a vehement appetite to eating, which he could not avoid to supply with one sort of food or the other." He just needed to eat all the time. "His entrails, his insides, were also ulcerated." They had ulcers, which is incredibly painful. "And the chief violence of his pain lay in his colon. An aqueous and transparent liquor also had settled itself about his feet, and a like matter afflicted him at the bottom of his belly." His feet and stomach was all swollen with fluid. "Nay, farther, his privy member was putrefied and produced worms." We're going to talk about that. "And when he sat upright, he had a difficulty of breathing, which was very loathsome on account of the stench of his breath and the quickness of its returns. He also had convulsions in all parts of his body, which increased his strength to an insufferable degree." It was basically having seizures. So pretty horrible. Pretty horrific. And I can't help but wonder how much of this was a direct consequence of what he did in attempting to kill the Son of God. Anyway, this disease did not bring humility or repentance in Herod's life, or in his death, so to speak. Herod knew that he was going to die soon, and he also knew that the people of Judea were not going to mourn his death. More likely, there'd be like celebrations and parties in the street. And so what he did was, shortly before he died, he sent letters out to all the most important people in the Jewish nation, ordering them to come and appear before him in Jericho, which is where he was staying at that time and getting his treatment and stuff. And once they got there, he ordered them, and Josephus says a great number came, because if you didn't come when Herod summoned you, that was like you could be executed. So they all came, and once they got there, he had them locked into the hippodrome in Jericho, which is basically like where they had the big chariot races, and he surrounded it with soldiers. And then he had his sister, Salome, and her husband, his brother-in-law, Alexis, he brought them in, and he basically pleaded with tears in his eyes to them to please do him this kindness, because they are his family after all. And he says, once I die, when I die, but before it's announced publicly, order the soldiers to basically fire arrows into the hippodrome until all those Jews are dead. Then you can announce that I've died. And he says that then he shall have a great mourning at his funeral, and such as never had any king before him. For then the whole nation would mourn from their very soul, which otherwise would be done in sport and mockery only. Pretty terrible, eh? It's like that way they'll be mourning when I die, not celebrating or mocking me. Anyway, thankfully, Salome and Alexis basically didn't listen to him, broke their promise. Once he died, they let them out and said, go home. But that was Herod. Now, after Herod died, this was his kingdom, the dark yellow color, and then this was Roman territory. And after he died, his kingdom was divided into 3 areas. Well, it was divided amongst his 3 sons, or 3 of his sons. So in the south, there was an area that was given to Herod Archelaus. In Galilee, so that's the Sea of Galilee, that province, as well as what's called Perea, which is on the other side of the Jordan River, was given to Herod Antipas. And then Philip was given up there, Syria, Lebanon, Damascus. Okay. So that's a little bit of the history. So it says that after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, it's time now basically for Jesus to go home, Messiah to return to Israel from Egypt. We don't know how long after so Herod died, as I said, somewhere between 4 and 2 BC. At some point after his death, the angel says, it's time to go home. We don't know when. What we do know is it had to have happened before 6 AD for some reasons that we'll see soon. But whether he was there an extra couple days, whether he was there in a few years, don't really know. Doesn't say. But we are told that Joseph got up, took his child and his mother, the child and his mother, and they returned to the land of Israel. Which kind of makes Joseph sound like he's a pretty obedient guy. He was told go, so he got up and went. It kind of almost reads like he did it the same day. I don't know if that's right or not, but that's how it reads. Cool. Okay. Then, who's got the mic?
When he heard that
Archelaus. Archelaus, I don't know.
Archelaus was reigning over Judea in a place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. After being warned in a dream, he went to the regions of Galilee. He came to a town called Nazareth and lived there. Then what had been spoken by the prophets was fulfilled, that Jesus would be called a Nazarene.
Okay, so he's told he needs to go back to Israel. And then it says, it kind of sounds as though he was intending to go back to Judea, right? My guess is Bethlehem, that he was planning to go back to Bethlehem and settle there, which kind of makes sense. You're raising the Messiah, who's going to sit on the throne of his father David, where Where was David's throne? Jerusalem, yeah. Jerusalem, the capital. That's where the throne was going to be. It makes sense to raise the future king of Israel near where he's going to reign, and Bethlehem is really close to Jerusalem. Plus, as I said, I can imagine they weren't super excited to go back to Nazareth, seeing as that's where they were from, and everybody knew them there, and there was probably all sorts of rumors and things still about Mary and how she got pregnant without being married and all that stuff. So, anyway, it sounds as though they're planning to go to Judea, to Bethlehem, but then there was a problem. What was the problem?
You got warned in a dream.
About? Herod's son. So the problem was that the son that was ruling in Judea, this Archelaus, was arguably worse than his father, which is saying something. In fact, so that's where Bethlehem is. It's down there in his kingdom. And in fact, he was so bad that in 6 AD, and this is why we know that Jesus returned sometime before 6 AD, in 6 AD, a group of Jewish ambassadors, 50 of them, traveled all the way to Rome and appeared before Caesar Augustus in Rome and petitioned him, basically begged Caesar to make Judea a part of the Roman Empire, formally. Because up until then, Judea, all these places, were not technically part of the Roman Empire. They were little mini kingdoms that Rome allowed. So Rome basically allowed the Herod and then his sons to rule these little areas as their own little kingdoms. He obviously had to make sure that he didn't cause any trouble for Rome, because he's there only because Rome allows him to be, basically. And he'd have to pay tax, like a tribute to Caesar every year. But apart from that, he could basically run his little kingdom however he wanted and treat the people living there however he wanted. And so if you were living in these yellow parts, you had all the rights and protections that came to people living in the Roman Empire. But if you were living in these areas, you were basically whatever they wanted. That's what was going to happen to you, and you didn't have those protections. And so so these ambassadors come to Caesar and they basically say, Archelaus is destroying our nation. That he's called a king, but he's really a tyrant. He kills whoever he wants. He takes whatever he wants. We were once this rich, flourishing kingdom, and he's driving it into utter poverty. They say, the only way to avoid just getting beaten up and stuff in the streets, particularly by the soldiers and that, was to pay them enough silver and gold to protect yourself, and that the women in that kingdom, old and young, were being abused in horrible ways, and the only consolation was that it wouldn't be made public if you paid enough money to the officials. And so they said that Herod had put such abuses upon them as a wild beast would not have put on them if he had the power given him to rule over us. If you put an animal in charge of us, he would not treat us as badly as Herod is treating us. And so they beg Caesar to bring Judea, this province of Judea, under direct Roman rule instead of its own little private kingdom. And Josephus says that their main thing that they desired was this, that they might be delivered from kingly and the like forms of government and might be added to Syria and be put under the authority of such presidents of theirs as should be sent to them. Basically, they said, we don't want to be ruled by kings anymore. We want to be a part of the Roman Empire. Now, there's quite a sad irony in those words. About 1,000 years earlier, Israel did not have a king. They were led by God. God was supposed to be their king. But then they came to Samuel, who was the leader that God had appointed at that time. And they said to him, look, you're old. Your sons don't follow your ways. So now appoint over us a king to lead us, just like all the other nations have. We want a king, like all the other nations have. Now Samuel's not happy when he hears this, but like any good leader should, he takes it to God and says, like, what do I do here? And the Lord said to Samuel, do everything the people request of you, for it is not you that they have rejected, but it is me that they have rejected as their king. Just as they have done from the day that I brought them up from Egypt until this very day, they have rejected me and have served other gods. This is what they are doing also to you. So now do as they say, but you must warn them and make them aware of the policies of the king who will rule over them. So God basically says, it's not you that they're rejecting. I'm supposed to be their king. They're rejecting me. And he's like, do what they say, but warn them. Tell them what it's going to be like to have a king. And so Samuel goes out to the people and he says, do you understand what you're asking for? Do you understand what having a king is going to be like? What they're going to do to you? He says, a king will force your sons to basically go and die in his battles. He's going to force your daughters to come and serve him in his palace. He's going to take the best of everything that you have, your crops, your land, your cattle, and he's going to give it to his friends. And you're going to become his slaves. And in that day, you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord won't answer you in that day. But the people refused to heed Samuel's warning. Instead, they said, no, but we will have a king. There will be a king over us. We will be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, and he will lead us and fight our battles. Tragic, right? Yeah, God knew exactly what was going to happen. Unfortunately, the people were too stubborn or stupid to believe him and had to learn the lesson the hard way, which I don't know if that's relatable to anybody, but that's definitely me a lot of the time. If only we would believe that God actually knows what he's talking about when he says, don't do that, it's going to hurt you, you know? But anyway, they said, no, we want a king. Even more tragic is that after suffering under a king, under kings, the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, the king of Babylon, the king of Persia, Greece, now Herod, after suffering for 1,000 years under the rule of kings, they've given up and said, we don't want a king anymore. Right at the moment that the true king has come, you know? Yeah, it's very sad. Anyway, Caesar Augustus agrees to their request, and in 6 AD, Archelaus is deposed, he's removed as king, and this province of Judea becomes formally a part of the Roman Empire. And instead of a king, Rome appoints these what are called prefects or governors in their place. And they have a whole series of them. Eventually in 26 AD, it's Pontius Pilate who gets appointed governor of the province of Judea. And that's, I don't know, kind of interesting because, so he's ruling on behalf of Rome up down here, but up here is still Herod Antipas, ruling his own little kingdom up in Galilee. So, if we go back to the story, Joseph is afraid to go to Judea because Archelaus is the king there and he's worse than Herod the Great. And he was apparently right to be afraid, and that was confirmed by God in a dream when he warned him, don't go there. And so we're told that instead, he took his young family and he went to the regions of Galilee. And it said Galilee was its own little kingdom. Oh, yeah. That's where it is at the moment. It's its own little kingdom ruled by a different Herod, one of Herod the Great's other sons, Herod Antipas, who had his problems, but he wasn't nearly as bad as Herod the Great or his brother Archelaus. And that's the Herod who is king when Jesus is, when his ministry begins up there. And that's the Herod that Pilate sends Jesus to during his trial. Because he's most of the stuff that Jesus did was up in your kingdom. Here's your problem. you know? Okay. And this Antipas ruled this region of Galilee right through to 39 AD. So after Jesus, at some point he married somebody called Herodias, who was his niece, and the husband of Philip, we believe. And that's where John the Baptist comes out and he's like, you should not be doing this, and like it rebukes him publicly. And then that's what gets him arrested and ultimately executed, is telling Herod, this marriage is bad, you shouldn't be doing this. And then eventually Herod Antipas is overthrown by his nephew Agrippa II, Herod Agrippa II, and he's the Herod who's ruling in Galilee during the book of Acts, with Paul gets sent to Herod and stuff. It's that Herod, his nephew. Anyway, so Joseph takes Mary and Jesus and they go up to Galilee. And then we're told that he came to a town called Nazareth and lived there. Now, if we only had the Gospel of Matthew, you actually would not have heard of Nazareth before. And so you might wonder, like, if you were just reading the book of Matthew, you'd be like, I wonder why they ended up in Nazareth. But this is where it's so cool having like multiple testimonies, multiple records of Jesus' life, as you bring Luke in there. And if you've read Luke, actually Nazareth is where they began. That's where Mary, probably Joseph, had lived before she got pregnant. And so you get this, like, you have these multiple gospels and they're not contradicting with each other. They're actually complementing each other. They're like filling in gaps and answering questions you might have if you only had one of them, which is exactly what you'd expect from like multiple eyewitnesses, which is really cool. Anyway, so what we know is that actually by going to Nazareth, they're kind of returning home. We also know, with the benefit of Luke, that could not have been an easy thing to be doing, that it must have been pretty scary to go back there. And required a lot of courage or faith, which is kind of can be the same thing. So Nazareth is up here in Galilee, in Herod Antipas's kingdom. Now, as I said, it would have been very hard going back there. We're all going to have situations in our lives where we know that we have to do something that's really hard, scary, humiliating maybe. And in those moments, it's really important that you cling to Jesus, basically, that you remember. Have I got it in there? Yeah, this verses like this in Philippians that says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's the faith, that's the courage that allows us to do those things that are hard, but that we know are the right things to do. Anyway, so they come to Nazareth. It's a little village. It's in north of Judea and Samaria, which is down south in the pink part. Nazareth, little village. It's about like 40 kilometers to the Mediterranean Ocean, about 30 kilometers to the Sea of Galilee. That's kind of like the distance from here to Muriwai, if you were walking or riding a donkey or something. Quite a long way, I think, if you're walking. But anyway, unfortunately, Nazareth didn't have a great reputation. There's a little bit later, you have Philip, who has just met Jesus and believes Jesus is the Messiah, and so he runs all excited to his friend Nathanael. He's like, you need to come and meet Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael says, can anything good come from Nazareth? Fairly or unfairly, I don't know. Nazareth had a pretty bad reputation. It was sort of like Israel's version of Hamilton, probably. Yeah, fairly or unfairly. No, not making any judgment, and no offense to anybody from Hamilton, but can anything good come from there? That's basically what he's saying. But even there, I think it's so cool because basically it's another demonstration of Jesus' humility, that he was willing to be associated with those who the rest of the nation despised and rejected. That he wasn't ashamed. Like the rest of his life, Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene. And he wasn't ashamed to be associated with Nazareth. And he's not ashamed to be associated with me or you. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, Matthew says that. The fact that Jesus ended up living in Nazareth was something, it fulfilled the words that were spoken by the prophets, that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. That's becoming kind of familiar in Matthew, right? This is actually the 5th time that he's been like, thus fulfilled what was spoken by the prophets. He's again and again and again making the point that every little detail of Jesus' life fulfilled something that God spoke about in the Old Testament. That Jesus' whole life is a fulfillment of the scriptures. And so this is actually the 5th time in 26 verses that Matthew has made that same point. In Matthew 1, verse 22, it was that Jesus was born of a virgin and thus fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. In chapter 2, the fact that he was born in Bethlehem, the fact that he went to Egypt, the fact that all the babies were killed in Bethlehem. And now Matthew says it's even true of the town that he lived in, that he grew up in, that even that fulfilled the scriptures. But here's the thing. Nowhere in the Old Testament does it say that the Messiah would come from Nazareth. In fact, the word Nazareth does not appear in the Old Testament. There is no town there if Nazareth existed in ancient Israel, it is not mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament. So again, and you might have picked this up, a lot of the prophecies that Matthew's referring to, it's not obvious what he's talking about, why this is prophetic. And this is another one of those. What does it mean? Why does he say that this fulfilled what the prophet spoke if Nazareth doesn't even exist in the Old Testament?
Is that the question you're asking?
Well, that's the question that we have to ask, right? That's the question I had to ask. What's he talking about? How is this a fulfillment of prophecy? So there's a clue in the words, in the way that he words this. He says, so normally, in all of the previous examples, it's a single prophet that's speaking, right? Thus fulfilled, or this fulfilled what the prophet spoke, or what the Lord spoke through the prophet, and then usually it'll be like saying or writing, and then what it is. But this time it's a bit different. He says, then what had been spoken by the prophets, plural. So he's not talking about a specific prophet, and he's not talking about a specific words in a specific place. He's saying that this is something that is spoken more generally by multiple prophets in the Old Testament, that Jesus would be called the Nazarene. But again, what does that mean? How? Something that a lot of people think is that basically he's making a pun between the word. So in the Old Testament, there's a thing called the Nazarite vow. Have you heard of that? It shows up in Numbers chapter 6. Nazarite. And basically, and that word Nazarite is based on in Hebrew it's Nazir, and it's based on a word Nazar, which means to be dedicated, consecrated, set apart, devoted. And so basically the idea is that if you wanted to get especially close to God for some other reason, what you could do is take the Nazarite vow for some length of time, a month. I'm going to take the Nazarite vow for a month. And that was basically a way of separating yourself to God for a month. And in particular, you weren't allowed to eat or drink anything that was made with grapes. So definitely no wine, but not even like raisin cakes, like nothing from grapes. You're also not allowed to cut your hair for that time. And you're also not allowed to touch any dead bodies. So even if your parents die or your brother dies, you're not allowed to touch their body for that length of time while you're set apart, separated to God for that time, yeah? Now, Jesus obviously was set apart, right, for God. He was something quite special. But he was not a Nazarite. Samson lived as a Nazarite. Well, didn't do a very good job of it, but he was supposed to be a Nazarite, yeah? Samuel was, it seems as though, was probably lived as a Nazarite his whole life. Never touched anything, never touched any dead bodies, didn't cut his hair, so he must have been pretty woolly, and didn't have anything from grapes. John the Baptist lived as a Nazarite, as far as we know. But Jesus didn't. We know he drank wine, right? It's Passover. He touched dead bodies. They came to life again, but still. He was not a Nazarite. And again, nowhere in the Old Testament does it even say that the Messiah is going to be a Nazir, a Nazarite. So again, I don't think that's what's going on here. I don't think that's what Matthew's talking about. I think Matthew's actually making a different point that is kind of lost in translation into English, into Greek and into English, because the word for Nazareth in Greek is Nazara. But remember, that word there is no Nazareth in the Old Testament. So now we have to start with the Greek and we have to figure out what is the Hebrew word that he's referring to as Nazareth, right? Or Nazarene. And if you remember, written Hebrew has no vowels, only consonants. So what are the letters that you would transliterate this into if you were going back into Hebrew? NZR. And that is Nazar, right? So that makes sense. That's how you end up from Nazareth to Nazarite, Nazir. It's based on those NZR. But as we said, there's no prophecy in the Old Testament that that the Messiah will be Nazir or Nazar. But there is another word in Hebrew that's very close to this one. It's the word netzer. In Hebrew, there's just one letter different. Instead of a zayin, which is a z, there's a tzadi, which is a ts sound, ts. Yeah? The thing is, Greek has no letter like ts. It has no equivalent to a tzadi. The closest it has is a zeta, which technically is a dz sound, z. But in English, we just have a z. What that means is either or both of these words, if you were to transliterate them from Hebrew into Greek, they're both going to be the same. They're both going to be Nazara. Does that make sense? And so what I think is that what he's referring to here as Nazarene is not coming from the word Nazar. It's actually coming from the word netzer. The question then is, what does netzer mean? Well, netzer is a word in Hebrew that means a shoot, a sprout, or a branch. The first place that this word shows up in the Old Testament is in Isaiah chapter 11, where God says, "A shoot will grow out of the stem of Jesse, a branch will sprout from his roots. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, a spirit of wisdom and of understanding, a spirit of counsel and of might, a spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will take delight in obeying the Lord. He will not judge by mere appearances or make decisions on the basis of hearsay. But with righteousness he will judge the needy, with justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Justice will be like a belt around his waist, and faithfulness will be like a belt around his hips. Who is this branch? Jesus, right? Correct. He is the branch who will grow out of the root of Jesse. Who is Jesse? David's father. Yeah, exactly. That's the promised Messiah, the promised King of Israel. And that is, I think, what Matthew is talking about when he says he will be called a Nazarene. He will be called a branch. Yeah, branch. Yeah. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, and he'll wear justice and faithfulness like a belt. Now, Isaiah is the only prophet that uses this word netzer about Jesus. But remember, Matthew said prophets, right? Plural, that multiple prophets are going to talk about Jesus being the Nazarene, the branch. The thing is, apparently in Hebrew, there are about 20 words that mean something like branch. Don't know. And there is another word that means basically exactly the same thing in Hebrew. I don't know what the difference is and why there's two. But this word semach means exactly the same thing. It's shoot, branch, it's something that grows out of something else. And this word is used by two prophets, Jeremiah and Zechariah. This is how Jeremiah uses it. He says, I, the Lord, affirm, the time will certainly come when I will fulfill my gracious promise concerning the nations of Israel and Judah. In those days and at that time, I will raise up for them a righteous branch of David. He will do what is just and right in the land. Under his rule, Judah will enjoy safety and Jerusalem will live in security. At that time, Jerusalem will be called, the Lord has provided us with justice. And he says something very similar in Jeremiah 23. This is how Zechariah uses the word semach. He says, listen now, Joshua the high priest, both you and your colleagues who are sitting before you, all of you are a symbol that I am about to introduce my servant, the branch. And a little bit later he says, the Lord of heaven's army says, look, here is the man whose name is branch, who will sprout up from his place and build the temple of the Lord. Indeed, he will build the temple of the Lord, and he will be clothed in splendor, sitting as king on his throne. Who's that? Very clearly Jesus. And Zechariah says that the branch is like literally his name or title, that he will be known as the branch. And so that, I think, is that is what Matthew's saying, right? He's saying that prophecy, that Jesus will be called the branch, that he will have the title the branch, is at least partly fulfilled in the fact that he grew up in the branch town, in Nazareth. And because of that, and he's not wrong, because of that decision, because Joseph chose to live there with Jesus for the rest of Jesus' life, he was known as Jesus of the branch town. Jesus the Nazarite, Jesus the Nazarene. In fact, when Pilate ordered Jesus crucified, and he ordered them to write down his title on a board and nail it to the top of his cross, what did he tell them to write? Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Jesus the branch, the King of Jews. The Bible's cool, eh? How it all comes together. And there's something in there, which I wasn't going to go into, but anyway, in the Gospels, you'll actually see two versions of this. He's from a place called Nazareth, right? And then he's Jesus. Sometimes he's Jesus of Nazareth. Sometimes he's Jesus the Nazarite, which I think is the same thing. Nazarite, the word that's translated Nazarite is an adjective. It's somebody who's from a particular place, and he's from Nazareth. But most of the times that it's used, including here, it's Jesus the Nazarene. And this is it's a noun. It's turning the name Nazareth into a title. that's then applied. He is Jesus, the branch, basically. Yeah. Cool, eh? So, with that, we finish Matthew chapter 2. And Matthew's record of Jesus' birth and his young little life. But before we end today, and we're actually doing quite good today. We might be able to do some questions. Before we end today, we're going to jump back across to Luke and look at 2 verses. Basically, Luke's summary of what we've just been reading about in Matthew. So what Luke says is this. Somebody want to read that? There you go.
So when Joseph and Mary had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him.
Okay, so this is Luke chapter 2, and we're obviously picking up, he had been, he wrote a bunch of stuff in Luke chapter 2, and then this. So immediately before these verses, what we read about in Luke is Joseph and Mary taking Jesus to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices in the temple, sacrifices that were required by the law of Moses or the law of the Lord. Yeah, and then they meet Simeon, the old man, and they meet Anna. And they come and worship Jesus in the temple, and all that. And then the next thing we read is, so when Joseph and Mary had performed everything according to the law, which you assume is those sacrifices in Jerusalem, they returned to Galilee, to their own town. Quite a bit happened, right, between verses 38 and 39 in Luke, which is not recorded in Luke, but thankfully we have multiple records, and we have the book of Matthew. And yes, as it turns out, there's a lot that happened. They actually returned to Bethlehem. Then the wise men showed up, worshipped Jesus, gave him all sorts of fancy gifts. Then they had to rush off to Egypt to get away from all the massacre of babies that was happening in Bethlehem. They stayed in Egypt, we don't know how long, and then eventually returned to Israel and returned to Nazareth in Galilee. And so again, aren't you glad that we've got more than one record of Jesus' life and the good news of Jesus. And it's actually it's a really nice illustration of how well the stories come together and how useful it is to have more than one. How they complement each other and fill in gaps. Because if we had, so both Luke and Matthew, we know that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. But Matthew starts there. So if you were just reading the book of Matthew, you'd assume maybe they lived in Bethlehem. Luke tells us, no, actually they had to go to Bethlehem from Nazareth. And then in Luke, we're told they went from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices in the temple. And then we're told they went back to Nazareth. And so you would assume they went to Nazareth from Jerusalem. But thanks to Matthew, we know actually that's not true. They then went back to Bethlehem. And then they went from Bethlehem to Egypt. And then they kind of thought about going from Egypt back to Bethlehem, but that didn't seem like a good idea. And so in the end, they went back to Nazareth. And it all kind of comes together. Cool way. It's like putting puzzle together and all the pieces just fit nicely. It's quite exciting. Yeah. Cool. And then we're told that the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was on him. Which is a phrase that comes up a little bit, something very similar Luke said about John the Baptist, and something very similar said about Samuel when he grows up. But basically, Jesus grew up, and he grew up well in the Spirit and with lots of wisdom, which we'll look at next week, because the reality is we know very, very little about Jesus' childhood. The only other thing, Luke tells us one more story, which is what we'll look at next week. He's like a 12-year-old boy. So what happened between now, when he's presumably still a little baby, maybe 18 months old, maybe a few years, I don't know, until he's 12, don't know. And then after he's 12, the next we read about is when he starts his ministry and he's 30. And I won't lie, like I'd love to know more about what went on during those years. And there are apparently these things called infancy gospels or infant gospels or something that people wrote hundreds of years later to, I guess, fill that curiosity that people had about what Jesus' life was like. And then they wrote all sorts of weird things like he made little clay birds and then clapped his hands and they came to life and flew away. And he talked from the manger, apparently. Yeah, and some kid was bullying him and he cursed him, said, "You're going to wither on the spot," and he withered up and died. Yeah, and obviously that's all nonsense, but which is why there was a quote that I saw that where God is silent, we should have no ears or something like that. That basically, like, God has told us what we needed to know, and hopefully one day I'll be able to chat to Mary and find out what he was like. But obviously not important, right? That there's a verse in 2 Timothy where Paul says, "All Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the person dedicated to God may be capable and equipped for every good work." We've been told everything we need to know for salvation, and we've been told everything we need to know in order for us to be dedicated to God and capable and equipped for every good work. And so we have to trust that we have what we need. Well, we do have what we need. Yeah, plenty. Cool. Let us pray, and then we can fill in some time with maybe a question or two. Lord God, I thank you so much for today. Again, I thank you so much for your word, Lord. I thank you for the comfort and encouragement it is that we have, that for all that you've given us, for all that you've told us, and that we know everything we need to know in order to know that you love us, to know what you've done to save us and to sanctify us and make us more like you. And I pray and ask that you would work in our lives, Lord, that you would teach us to trust you more and more every day. And that you would continue to make us more like you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's look at a jar. I haven't actually organized it properly. So hopefully the things that are in there we're not done. Okay, that's an interesting question. Christian actually asked me this yesterday, so that's kind of useful. Okay, question. How can Old Testament people access heaven if the law is impossible to keep? So basically the question is, how were people saved in the Old Testament or before Jesus? Go on. Yeah, what? Yeah, loudly. Yeah, it's actually like exactly the same way that we're saved. So if in Romans it says that, it gives Abraham as an example. And it says that, come on. Romans 4.
I thought they just killed the lamb.
Well, the question is, well, okay, let's go then. Romans chapter 3 says, we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For no one is declared righteous before him by the works of the law. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. So the law did not save anyone, is what Paul says. No one is declared righteous by the law. You cannot live righteously enough, and it talks about in Hebrews, basically, the blood of bulls and goats isn't enough to take away sin. Otherwise, if you could be saved by sacrifices in the Old Testament, there'd be no need for Jesus. So then the question is, okay, well then how were they saved? Surely people were saved in the Old Testament. And in the next chapter in Romans, it talks about what then shall we say that Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh, has discovered regarding this? What did he figure out in terms of salvation? And it says, for if Abraham was declared righteous by works, he has something to boast about. So if he was declared righteous, if he was saved by the things that he did, by keeping the law, even though he was before the law, then he'd be like, he's the one who saved himself, right? He'd have something to boast about. But what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That Abraham was not righteous. Abraham believed God, and then he was treated as though he was righteous, even though he isn't, which kind of sounds familiar, right? That's salvation. What does it mean to believe God, or to believe in God, or have faith in God?
To have a relationship. Or to have it.
What does it mean to believe in something?
Put your trust in.
Put your trust in, yeah. It's to trust. Abraham trusted God. Now the question is, what did he trust him to do, right? So what we're trusting, the specific of what we're trusting God for is a little bit different. In the Old Testament, they were trusting that if they were faithful to God and they offered the sacrifices that he told them to sacrifice, that he would be faithful to them and save them. Now we're trusting that if we trust in Jesus, if we follow him, God will be faithful. But it's still just trust.
If we could have just believed in God, why is there Jesus? If we could just believe in God and not Jesus.
Because sin still had to be dealt with.
Yeah, but it was dealt with by God in the Old Testament.
No, it was dealt with by Jesus.
But then how did he get to heaven if God didn't deal with his sin?
Because of what Jesus was going to do.
So he was saved before Jesus died because of Jesus' death.
It's only Jesus' death and resurrection that fixes sin, that solves the problem of sin. But the way that we have access to that is by trusting in God.
So Jesus died for everyone before and after him.
Correct.
So it's like Abraham got in because he literally had no other option except to have a relationship with God. But because we have Jesus, we have to believe in Jesus in order to get to heaven.
Yeah. Like God obviously was revealing more and more with time. And so what people understood and what was expected of them from God, what belief and trust looked like. But the heart is the same, right? It's that like simple trust to God. But yeah. But no, it's like same before and after. It's always Jesus, but it's access through faith, through trust. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. And if you get into like quantum physics-y stuff, time, when things happen become a little bit less meaningful. Like the fact that Jesus hadn't died yet, sure, in time he hasn't died, but from an eternal perspective it's already happened, so it's kind of all, you know? Yeah.
They wouldn't have known about it.
No, they didn't know about it. So they didn't have to believe that Jesus had died for their sins. They had to trust that God was going to save them, despite their own sinfulness. Don't get one of the piles.
If God can do anything, does that mean he can sin if he wanted to?
Yeah.
Ask this question.
Yeah,
Have we asked that one already? Okay, good. So what's the answer?
no,
It's not in his nature.
he can't.
Well, the question is, can he do anything he wants to? No. Yeah. So he can't sin. He can't do anything.
Well, he doesn't want to sin.
Yeah. Sorry? He can do anything within his nature. He can do anything in the world, like from a miraculous kind of, laws of nature and stuff like that are all within his control. So in that sense, he can do anything, but he can't actually do anything. He can't lie, for example, because it's not in his nature.
If Jesus looked like a regular Jew, how was he recognized as the Messiah even as a child?
Because of the clay birds coming out of his hand.
Just for the record, those things did not happen, okay? Just these are things that were written by people a long time later. That was just nonsense. How was he recognized as the Messiah, even as a child? Well, okay. How did Simeon and Anna recognize him as the Messiah? In the temple. How did the wise men identify him? The star took them there, right? So Simeon, it says, was brought into the temple by the Spirit. So it was God who spoke to him and said, that's him. It wasn't like he was like, whoa, what's that shining baby? Why is it glowing? That's not what's going on. It's just a normal baby. But God can speak to us, right? And these were people who were obviously very in tune with God's Spirit. Anna, it said, never left the temple. She was old, 106 or something like that, and she basically just lived there, prayer and fasting. And so, so the God spoke to them. And then you come later, like, it's not obvious that through his childhood, everybody was like, that's the Messiah. At the point that he revealed himself, how did John the Baptist know that Jesus was the Messiah? We haven't got there yet. But where does Jesus first appear as an adult? Before that. It's before that. What is John the Baptist doing? Baptizing. And Jesus comes out to be baptized. And then what happens? Spirit of God descends on him like a dove. John hears a voice from heaven. This is my son, whom I love. Right? I think? Yeah. So God's speaking to him. And then Jesus starts teaching. And how do people know that he's the Messiah then?
I'm guessing the big voice from heaven.
No, most of them didn't hear a voice from heaven. But it was the miracles that he was doing. So there were specific things that had to point people to Jesus, that this is who he claimed, and the things obviously that he was saying about himself, and then the evidence that supported what he was saying. But it wasn't ever that there was something obvious looking at him that was like, oh, that guy must be God. Yeah. Wouldn't know. Yeah. Okay. One more maybe. Come on, all you got to do is pull it out.
Does reincarnation exist in the New Testament?
Does reincarnation exist in the New Testament? That's an interesting question as well. So, does reincarnation exist in the New Testament? The first question, I guess, would be, what is reincarnation?
When you die, you come back as an ant.
Not an ant.
It's like something. Just something like example with that.
So, resurrection definitely exists in the New Testament. Yeah? There are people who are raised to life. Jesus was raised to life, and we're promised that we will be raised to life. But that is something quite different to reincarnation. The Bible specifically actually says man is appointed to die once, and then I think appear before God in the judgment or something like that.
Did Lazarus die once?
No, he was an exception. Okay, so that's one thing, right? We're promised that having died, we ourselves are going to be raised to life as ourselves, be given a new body, etc., etc., a spiritual body. Reincarnation is something different. Reincarnation comes through primarily Hinduism and Buddhism, I think. And it's the idea that basically that life is a continual series of death and rebirth, death and rebirth, death and rebirth. And that during your life, the things that you do accrue karma. So you build up good karma and you build up bad karma. And depending on how much good and bad karma you build up in your life, that'll determine what you will be born as in the next life. And the idea is that God as a there isn't like a God that's separate from creation, from the universe. God is like a spiritual force that is a part of all life, like the force. And what your basic, and so there is, in a sense, God in every living thing, from an ant to a person. And you're basically on a journey through life of trying to get closer and closer to when you become one with the force, one with God. You enter nirvana, and that happens by basically getting to a point where your life is completely good karma and no bad karma. And even as a human, there are different levels. And so that's where in like Hinduism you have the caste system, and you begin as a Dalit, which is like the lowest level of human. It's like, seriously, and then as you progress, you move up through the caste system until you get reborn as a priest in the priestly caste, as a Brahmin, and then eventually you progress to the point where you enter nirvana, you become a part of the universe. Yeah.
How do you know how much good karma and bad?
Well, that's the crappy thing. You have no idea. The things that you are suffering, in this life, in theory, are a consequence of the things you did in your past life.
But if you can't remember your past life, then how are you supposed to know how much karma?
And so you get born into a Dalit family. You're there because of the terrible things you did in your last life. And you need part of this life of suffering, where you're basically just cleaning out the sewers in the town, is a way of paying off your bad karma from the things you did in your last life. And so for somebody else to come and help you and reduce your suffering a bit in your life is like you're actually prolonging their suffering. And it's better just to let them suffer and get rid of that bad karma so that hopefully in the next life they'll have a better life. You know?
You're the person who's helping the other person.
That's good for you.
Yourself.
I think that's good for you.
So we're like prolonging suffering, but that's good.
Yeah, because they obviously did something terrible in their last life. Yeah. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a cruel, anyway. That's partly why like Christianity was very, like it spread very fast in at least parts of India, because the Christians would come in and help these people. Gospel for Asia, which was a big missionary group in India for a long time, they'd set up wells and they'd put Jesus' words, "Come to me, all you, like anybody who's thirsty, come to me and drink." And it's like, this is a well for everybody, even the Dalits, because they weren't allowed to use the wells that belonged to people in higher classes. So yeah, so anyway, that sense of reincarnation absolutely is not in the Bible, and is obviously completely incompatible with what the Bible teaches. But obviously resurrection is the idea that having died once, you're going to be resurrected to life again. Cool. All right, I think they're done now.